Grace Miller barely registered the faint music from the restaurant speakers or the scent of roasted thyme lingering in the hallway. All she could focus on was keeping her breath steady, one hand against the bathroom wall, the other clenched tight at her side. Her scarf had twisted at her throat during the shove, the silky knot now caught in Carl Denton's fingers. He hadn't grabbed her hard, not yet. But his eyes said everything that he could and maybe would if no one stopped him. To the customers at Harborview, Grace was elegance and ease, the dependable waitress with the steady smile and perfect posture. But behind the pristine table settings and waterfront view, there were cracks. Carl saw her not as a professional, but as a placeholder. Too quiet, too careful, too expendable. That afternoon had started just like hundreds before it. Crisp napkins, reserved seats, laughter echoing off glass. Grace had glided through lunch service like clockwork, balancing wine, entrees, and compliments. But a bumped elbow and a spilled Cabernet had been all it took. The rich red stain spread across Carl's white shirt like a wound, and with it, his mask slipped. The dining room went silent. Grace barely had time to mutter, "I'm so sorry," before Carl hissed through his teeth, "Bathroom." Now. She followed, past frozen coworkers and unblinking guests. Past the hostess who looked down, and the bartender who silently reached for his phone but didn't dial. Inside the restroom, the door locked behind them with a snap that sounded final. And then Carl unleashed it all, his bitterness, his ego, his fear masquerading as authority. His words turned sharper, more venomous, until they felt like weapons. "You think being married to some Navy man makes you untouchable," he spat, his hand tightening on her scarf. "If you've ever known what it feels like to stay silent too long, to swallow your fear for the sake of peace, to wonder if anyone will ever step in for you, then this story is for you." Because what Carl didn't know, what no one else in that restaurant knew, was that Grace's husband had already walked through the front door. And he wasn't just any husband. He was Admiral Richard Miller, in full dress whites, with steel in his stare and the calm fury of a man trained to fight wars, not watch the woman he loves be cornered by a coward. Before we continue, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more exciting stories that you won't want to miss. The day had begun with strategy, structure, and classified slides, the kind of morning Richard Miller had come to master over decades of service. The Naval Security Summit at the regional base wrapped earlier than expected, the final briefing adjourned before noon. As officers filtered out discussing fleet rotations and diplomatic briefings, Richard's mind drifted somewhere else entirely. He reached for his phone to call Grace, then paused, thumb hovering just above the screen. No, this time, he'd surprise her. He knew her shifts like clockwork, the rhythm of her days memorized across oceans and years apart. Harborview wasn't far, and it wasn't formal, but Grace made it feel that way. She always had a quiet grace, even when the world tried to dim it. The drive over was calm, the city traffic sparse as his thoughts looped back through the years. How many times had she waited for him? How many times had he promised, "Next time I'll be there"? Richard arrived in full dress whites, not for spectacle, but because duty had called him that morning, and he hadn't yet changed. As he stepped into the Harborview lobby, heads turned and chatter softened, like a tide suddenly receding. He gave a polite nod to the hostess, who blinked at his uniform, her mouth slightly agape. "I'm here to see Grace Miller," he said with a calm, practiced warmth. She nodded slowly, then quickly, nervously, before gesturing toward the dining area. He walked further in, the scent of lemon butter and rosemary trailing faintly in the air. The lunch rush had passed, but the room still held that warm hum of silverware and lingering guests. Richard scanned the room like he'd scan a deck, eyes sharp, noting posture, expressions, silence where there should be sound. A tray of glasses lay toppled near a booth, a dark red stain blotched across a tablecloth and the floor. No sign of Grace. Something in the air felt off. It wasn't just the wine on the carpet or the frozen expressions of two nearby servers. Richard moved toward the counter and noticed the staff, the bartender polishing the same glass twice, the line cook frozen mid-step. No one met his eye directly. He was used to tension, but this wasn't protocol or pressure. This was fear pretending to act normal. "Excuse me," he said to a passing waiter. "Is Grace here?" The young man jolted like a recruit called out in formation. She's in the back," he said, then looked toward the hallway near the restrooms. His eyes flicked down and away, not holding the Admiral's gaze. Richard didn't need any more signs. As he stepped toward the hallway, he caught a whisper, not words, but tone. Raised, sharp, slicing through the muffled hush like a wire pulled taut. The voice was male, aggressive, bouncing off tile and metal. Another voice followed, quieter, steadier, female. Richard's pace quickened. Carl Denton's voice, as it turned out, wasn't hard to recognize. Richard had only met him once, during a holiday dinner at the restaurant 2 years ago. He remembered the handshake, too firm, too long, and the smile that never reached his eyes. Grace had insisted he was just professional, but Richard had felt it then. Something about the man oozed control. Now, there was no mistaking the tone. Denton wasn't managing anyone. He was cornering. The hallway leading to the staff restrooms was tiled in white, clean but narrow, almost echo-like in its acoustics. Richard moved quietly but deliberately, each step calculated. As he neared the door, the words became clearer, incompetent embarrassment. "Lucky I let you work here." And then, something far worse, the subtle gasping sound of a woman trying not to cry. He stopped just short of the door. His hand hovered near the handle. He didn't want to barge in. He didn't want to escalate unless escalation was necessary. But in his gut, he already knew. The man inside wasn't just yelling. The door hadn't latched completely. Through the slight crack, Richard could see the scene unfolding, Carl's hand tight around Grace's scarf, her back against the wall, eyes wide but dry. Richard inhaled slowly, silently. His blood pulsed heavier now, not with rage, but with readiness. Not even a shout. Just a step forward, deliberate and unhurried. The door creaked open. Carl's voice died mid-insult, his body snapping upright. Grace turned her head first, then her eyes widened with recognition and disbelief. For the first time in weeks, she saw Richard's full uniform, his face, his presence. Her throat tightened with something between relief and heartbreak. Carl stumbled back half a step, confused at first, then stricken. His hand dropped away from the scarf, and he straightened as if trying to salvage authority. "Sir, Admiral, I didn't see you there," he began, the words as brittle as glass. Richard didn't respond. He stepped between them, forming a wall of calm precision. "Let go of my wife," Richard said, voice level, every syllable clean as command. Carl blinked, then looked to Grace as if for support, but found none. Richard didn't raise a fist. He didn't need to. The weight of who he was and who Grace was had already shifted the ground. Grace stepped quietly behind him, her breath catching in her chest. Carl's shoulders twitched, a flicker of panic overtaking his usual arrogance. "This is a misunderstanding," he muttered. "I was just," but Richard's gaze silenced him. "I've met men like you," Richard said, his voice like cold iron. "In briefing rooms, on battlefields, and courtrooms. They always think control means courage. But the second someone sees them clearly, they fold." Silence swelled in the bathroom like a tide pulling back. Richard turned slightly, offering his hand to Grace, who took it with quiet grace. He guided her out, not looking back. Carl didn't follow. As they stepped into the hallway, the noise of the restaurant returned, conversations, plates, murmurs, but subdued, like the whole place had been holding its breath. Heads turned. Staff paused mid-task. The Admiral had arrived, and the balance had shifted. Richard didn't speak to the staff, not yet. But his presence said everything. He and Grace walked back into the light, her steps steadier now, though her hands still trembled. And behind them, the door to that bathroom remained open, a symbol of what had just been exposed. This wasn't over. But it had begun. The scarf twisted tighter as Carl Denton's knuckles whitened against the silk. Grace could feel the pressure against her throat, not enough to choke, but enough to remind her he could. His breath was sour with rage, his voice a low, trembling growl. "You think that uniform your husband wears makes you important," he hissed. "You're nothing here, Grace. Nothing without this job." Her back was pressed to the cold tile wall, her hands flat against it, resisting the urge to push back. She knew better than to escalate, not here, not with someone like Carl. Her voice stayed low, controlled, her posture unflinching. "I didn't mean to spill the wine," she said quietly. "Let's both take a breath." But Carl didn't want to breathe. He wanted to see her shrink. That was how he measured power, by the silence he could pull from people. "You come in here acting like you're untouchable," he sneered, tightening his grip just slightly. "But you're just another sad woman playing waitress while her man plays war hero." Grace kept her eyes locked on his, even as her heartbeat skittered. There was strength in not flinching, in not giving him the flattery of fear. "You're angry," she said evenly. "But that doesn't give you the right to put your hands on me." Her voice didn't tremble, though every inch of her skin was pulsing with restraint. Carl scoffed, a bitter, condescending laugh. "Don't flatter yourself. You think I don't know what you're doing here? You needed a job, and I gave you one. You're not owed anything more than that." He stepped in closer, lowering his voice. "I could fire you right now. One word, and you're gone." "I know my rights," she said, her voice firmer now. "You don't get to," but the words caught as Carl shoved the back of his hand against the wall next to her head. Not hitting, just threatening. Just close enough to remind her what he could do, if he really wanted to. Her breath snagged, and she looked away for a second. Just one. That one moment was what Carl had been waiting for. "There it is," he murmured, triumphant. "The real you. The one who knows her place." His voice dripped with victory, his hand releasing her scarf as if he'd already won. But Grace didn't crumble. Not this time. She adjusted the scarf around her neck slowly, eyes hard now. "I'm not afraid of you," she said. "You're loud, Carl. But that's all you are." He moved to speak again, perhaps another insult, perhaps something worse, when the soft creak of the door stopped everything. The bathroom fell silent. Carl's mouth hung open mid-word. Grace's eyes flicked toward the mirror, and when she saw the reflection, her breath left her body in one sharp exhale. There, in the doorway, stood a man in dress whites, posture straight, eyes like cut steel. Admiral Richard Miller. Carl spun around, his face draining of color. For a second, he didn't move, didn't breathe, as the weight of the moment settled like dust after an explosion. His jaw worked silently, as though he were trying to form a sentence and finding none. Richard didn't step forward just yet. He simply stood there. Grace's knees went soft with relief, though she refused to show it. Her hand reached for the edge of the sink behind her, steadying herself quietly. Richard's gaze swept the room, one glance at Carl's posture, one at Grace's face, and everything became clear. The air itself shifted. Carl no longer held the center of gravity in the room. Power had changed hands. Carl swallowed hard. "Sir," he stammered. "Admiral, I didn't realize you." Richard walked in slowly, his movements controlled but unhurried. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His presence did the speaking for him, and every step he took toward Grace carved Carl out of the frame. "Let go of my wife," he said, each word crisp, final. Carl stumbled backward, both hands raised now, the way a child might before a reprimand. "I wasn't. It's not what it looked like, I swear." But even he didn't believe his own voice anymore. Richard didn't blink. He simply placed himself between Carl and Grace, shielding her with his body like a drawn line in the sand. "Is he hurting you?" Richard asked Grace, still not taking his eyes off Carl. "No," she said softly, and then louder, "not anymore." Carl opened his mouth, perhaps to defend himself, but Richard raised one gloved hand, palm out. "Don't," he said. "This isn't a negotiation." He stepped forward, his face just inches from Carl's. "Men like you thrive in corners. You prey on silence. But the thing about silence is sometimes it ends." Carl looked ready to faint. He backed into the tiled wall now, where Grace had stood just moments ago, his chest rising and falling rapidly. I didn't mean to." "You did exactly what you meant to," Richard interrupted, voice low, deadly calm. "You meant to intimidate, to dominate, to make her feel small." He looked over his shoulder at Grace now, his expression softening only for her. "But she's not small. She never has been. Carl let out a weak scoff, as if trying to reassert some kind of dominance. You don't get it, she's not who you think she is. Richard's head snapped back toward him with a glare so sharp it sliced through the rest of Carl's sentence. She's my wife, he said. And you're done speaking to her. The words hung in the air like a final verdict. Carl said nothing. Did nothing. The facade had finally cracked, and through it, all anyone could see was a coward. Richard turned back to Grace, offering his hand. She took it, slow but sure, her grip strong despite the tremor still in her bones. Together, they walked toward the door, the weight of 100 unspoken moments pressing behind them. Grace paused just before crossing the threshold. She turned her head slightly. You asked me what I am without this job, she said to Carl, her voice clear now. Turns out I'm still someone who knows when enough is enough. Then they left. Out in the hallway, the sounds of the restaurant returned, distant clinks, murmured voices, the low hum of an espresso machine. But something had changed in the air, something unspoken and undeniable. The Admiral was here. And something in that building had finally broken, not Grace. Carl, have you ever stayed quiet longer than you should have until one moment finally pushed you to speak? If this story resonates with you, leave a comment below. Your voice could be the one someone else needs to hear. The silence in the room was so dense it seemed to bend the air. Richard Miller stood tall in the center of it, his white uniform spotless, his presence eclipsing every sharp word that had come before. His gaze locked onto Carl with precision, cutting through the fog of excuses and false confidence. And then, in a voice so even it could have been mistaken for calm, he said, "Let go of my wife." The words didn't need to rise in volume. They carried their own weight. Carl Denton recoiled instinctively, like a flame had licked the edge of his pride. He let go of Grace's scarf immediately, as though realizing far too late how wrong this moment had gone. "Admiral, sir, this isn't what it looks like," he sputtered, adjusting his blazer with trembling hands. But the words came out dry, lifeless, stripped of the authority he once wielded behind closed doors. The room hadn't just turned, it had condemned him. Richard didn't move. He didn't clench his fists or raise his voice. He didn't need to. His silence held more power than Carl's shouting ever had. He simply placed himself between Grace and Carl, a wall that wouldn't be moved. Grace stood frozen for half a second, her breath still shallow in her chest. Then her feet moved, almost on their own, carrying her behind her husband, where safety wasn't just implied, but enforced. The moment her shoulder brushed his back, something shifted in her, not just protection, but recognition. She was seen. She was believed. Carl looked between them, calculating, scrambling. She's exaggerating, he tried again, but the sentence trailed off beneath the weight of Richard's silence. The Admiral hadn't blinked. Hadn't broken form. And in that stillness, Carl began to unravel. "Men like you," Richard said finally, "are always louder behind closed doors." His voice remained low, but it moved through the space like steel being drawn from a sheath. "You choose your victims carefully, women who don't shout back. You count on being feared more than you're challenged. But the thing about fear is it doesn't last." Carl's jaw twitched. He opened his mouth to defend himself again, but the words were brittle, half-formed. The authority he'd wrapped himself in, that managerial tone, that performance of control, had collapsed. All that remained was a man who'd gotten too used to no one watching. Until now. Richard turned slightly, just enough to glance at Grace. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his tone softening without losing its clarity. She shook her head. "No," she whispered. "Not anymore." Carl took a step back, a last-ditch attempt at reclaiming distance. "There's no need to escalate this," he said. "We can talk," Richard cut him off with a look. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fury. It was something far more dangerous to a man like Carl: accountability. "You lost the right to talk the moment you laid a hand on her," Richard said. "Now, you're going to listen." Grace's eyes didn't leave her husband. There was no grand outburst, no vengeful monologue. Just the quiet realization that someone had finally said the thing she'd never dared say out loud, that Carl's behavior wasn't just cruel, it was cowardly. And she wasn't alone in knowing it anymore. Richard took one slow breath, gathering the room like a commander gathering troops. "This ends now," he said. "And not because you've decided it should, but because someone better finally stood in front of you and said it." Carl looked like he might speak again, a twitch of denial flashing across his face, but the words withered before they ever found sound. He glanced toward the door, the last escape left. But Richard took one step forward, reclaiming the space again. And Carl, visibly diminished, stepped back once more. Richard extended his hand behind him. Grace didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and placed her hand in his, no longer hidden, no longer silent. Her back was straighter now, her breath steadier. They turned toward the door together, side by side, and Richard reached for the handle. The metal was cool beneath his fingers, but there was warmth in Grace's touch as she stood beside him. One more step, and they were no longer in the confines of that tiled box of shame and silence. They were moving forward, and Carl was being left behind. The door opened with a soft click, the kind that echoed louder in memory than in sound. The hallway outside was quiet, too quiet. When they stepped through, the restaurant seemed to exhale. Staff had stopped moving. Diners had stopped eating. Conversations had stopped mid-sentence. All eyes were on them. Richard's presence filled the hallway as if it were a parade route. Grace, now standing tall, no longer needed to shrink herself. She didn't look at Carl again, she didn't have to. His voice had always been loudest when no one else was listening. But today, the world had listened. The hallway was short, but the walk felt long. A gauntlet of stunned glances, held breath, and quiet recognition. The manager had been exposed. And the woman he'd tried to humiliate now walked out not ashamed, but vindicated. Just before the door swung shut behind them, Richard turned one last time. He didn't glare. He didn't threaten. He simply met Carl's eyes and said, "She stood through it longer than most. And today, she didn't have to stand alone." Then the door closed. And everything Carl thought he controlled collapsed. The restaurant felt like it was holding its breath. Forks hovered midair. Conversations halted mid-word. All eyes turned as Admiral Richard Miller stepped out from the staff hallway, his posture unflinching, his wife at his side. Grace walked beside him, silent, composed, her chin slightly raised, and for the first time in a long time, the room truly saw her. Carl trailed behind them, a few awkward steps back, his blazer tugged into place, trying to recover the dignity he'd lost moments earlier. He opened his mouth as if to address the dining room, but no one invited him to speak. A waitress paused, a glass in hand, while a man at the bar leaned forward, expression unreadable. Everyone had heard something, enough shouting, enough thuds, enough to know it hadn't just been an argument. And now everyone waited to see how it would end. "It was a misunderstanding," Carl said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. His voice trembled under a veneer of control, his eyes darting between faces looking back at him with skepticism. "Things got heated. That's all." But the staff knew better, had known for a long time, and none of them moved to back him up. No one nodded. No one spoke. The general manager, Harold Fenn, stepped into the main floor, summoned by the tension thick in the air. Tall and graying, he'd been running Harborview for over a decade, but in this moment, even he looked uncertain. His eyes found Carl first, then Richard, then Grace, and the math solved itself quickly on his face. "Can someone explain?" he started, but Richard held up a hand. "I'll keep it simple," Richard said, his voice measured and razor-sharp. "Your floor manager laid hands on my wife. Threatened her. Cornered her. Abused his authority." His next words dropped like a hammer. "You can either inform your board now, or I'll inform the press by morning." Harold blinked, stunned, glancing at Carl like he might suddenly deny it all. But Carl looked at the floor. His silence was louder than any admission. Grace stood tall, her arms by her side, saying nothing. Her stillness spoke more than any outburst could. "She spilled wine," Carl muttered, his voice smaller now, desperate for justification. "It was an accident," and Richard turned his head slowly, eyes narrowing. "And so you followed her into a restroom to humiliate her? Grabbed her scarf? Pinned her against the wall?" Each accusation landed with force, and each time, Carl failed to answer. "You're suspended," Harold said, voice shaking slightly as he looked at Carl. "Effective immediately." Carl's mouth dropped open, ready to argue, but even he knew there was no ground left to stand on. "What, Harold, you're seriously going to?" I said immediately, the GM repeated, firmer this time. "Leave." The line cook near the pass leaned forward, whispering just loud enough for others to hear, "It's about time." A ripple of agreement passed through the kitchen like the release of long-held breath. Carl stood frozen in place, but the room had already moved on without him. His power had been paper-thin all along, and now it had burned. Carl turned to Grace, eyes wild, voice low. "You think this makes you the hero? You think they're going to keep you around?" Grace didn't flinch. "I'm not trying to be a hero," she said quietly. "I'm just not afraid of you anymore." Harold cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable but resolute. "Carl, I need you to leave now. We'll arrange formal documentation later. Security will escort you if needed." The security guard from the front gave a small nod. He had heard enough too. Carl looked at the man, then back at Harold, but realized there was no escape route that preserved his ego. He walked out. Just like that. No applause followed, but the stillness that filled the room felt louder than cheers. Grace stood in the aftermath, composed but not smug, relieved but not shaken. She had simply endured, and then outlasted. The staff slowly returned to their tasks, but the air felt different now, lighter, as though an invisible weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. Plates clinked again, glasses refilled, but eyes still flicked toward Grace with something new behind them. Respect. Recognition. Quiet admiration. Richard stayed beside her, saying little but anchoring everything. His presence wasn't there to claim credit. It was there to bear witness, to prove that she mattered. That what had happened behind closed doors wouldn't stay buried anymore. Harold approached them, clearing his throat again. "Grace, I want to say I'm sorry," he began. "I should have looked closer. I should have seen you weren't the only one who didn't want to," she said gently. "But it's done now." "I'd like to offer you Carl's position," Harold said. "Effective tomorrow." A few heads turned at that. Even Richard looked briefly surprised. Grace, however, simply smiled. "Thank you," she said. "But I think I'm meant to build something new now." The room seemed to pause again, not in shock, but in understanding. Grace had chosen peace. And in doing so, she'd reclaimed her power. Later that night, long after the last customer had gone home and the floors were swept clean, a notice went out to the entire Harborview staff. Carl Denton had been officially terminated. A zero-tolerance policy on harassment was being drafted immediately. And anyone who had experienced similar treatment, past or present, was encouraged to speak to HR directly. Grace sat at her kitchen table, tea in hand, as Richard read the message out loud from his phone. She stared into the steam rising from the cup and felt something unfamiliar resting on her shoulders. Not weight, not dread. Relief. She wasn't just seen. She was finally heard. Have you ever witnessed someone get the justice they deserved after years of being ignored? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes the quietest people have the loudest stories, and your voice might be what gives someone else the courage to speak. The night air was still when Grace stepped onto the small balcony of their apartment overlooking the harbor. The faint sound of waves brushed against the docks below, mingling with the rhythmic creak of mooring ropes. Harborview's neon sign still glowed faintly in the distance, flickering like a heartbeat that refused to stop. She wrapped her scarf, the same one Carl had grabbed, around her shoulders, not for warmth, but for comfort. It still carried the faint scent of salt and red wine, reminders of what she'd survived and what she'd reclaimed. For the first time in months, her hands weren't trembling. The adrenaline had faded, leaving only a quiet ache, not fear anymore, but fatigue. She thought of the countless mornings she had arrived early, polishing cutlery before the sun had risen, smiling at coworkers who never really saw her. The nights she'd stayed late to cover shifts, hoping her effort would speak louder than Carl's criticism ever could. But effort, she'd learned, never silences cruelty, it only gives it something to feed on. Her mind drifted to the small humiliations that had piled up like dust in corners no one bothered to clean. The mistakes he'd blamed her for that weren't hers. The compliments that were really warnings. The meetings where she'd been made invisible. Every moment had been small enough to excuse until they weren't. She remembered the way he'd lower his voice whenever others passed by, that tone that carried ownership rather than authority. "You're too emotional," he'd said once, after she'd dared to question a decision. Another time, when she'd asked for a day off, he leaned in close and said, "You're replaceable, Grace. Remember that." Each word had settled in her bones like cold rain. And for years, she'd believed him. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, the smell of ocean air grounding her in the present. The fear that once lived behind her ribs had become something else, something steadier. Richard had been right when he told her that strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits, quiet, patient, until the world finally goes still enough to hear it. That was her kind of power. The moon hung low, slicing across the water like a silver blade. And as she leaned against the railing, a memory surfaced, a flash from years ago, back when her world had been all codes and ciphers instead of menus and napkin folds. She'd been stationed in naval intelligence, assigned to a listening post that never slept. Long hours, endless data, no room for mistakes. It had been pressure in its purest form, but it had been fair. She could still hear the sound of the teletype machines, the calm authority of her commanding officer's voice, the quiet respect between those who understood that discipline wasn't cruelty. There had been stress, exhaustion, even fear, but never degradation. Every person there had mattered. Every voice had counted. In that life, her worth had never been questioned. When Richard's deployments had grown longer, she'd traded the hum of naval halls for the clatter of dishes and soft chatter of strangers. She wanted peace, not status. Stability, not recognition. She thought she could find it in the rhythm of ordinary life, in simple routines, in laughter shared over coffee, in the stillness of waiting for him to come home. What she hadn't expected was how easily peace could be mistaken for weakness. Carl Denton had seen her stillness and thought it was surrender. He'd seen her gentleness and thought it was fear. But what he never understood was that peace takes more strength than control ever will. Grace had already lived through storms that would have broken him. She didn't need to shout to prove it. Behind her, the door slid open. Richard stepped out quietly, the faint creak of the floorboards the only sound he made. He was still in uniform, his medals glinting under the dim light of their balcony lamp. His presence filled the space, steady, grounding without interrupting the quiet she had built. For a while, they said nothing at all. He joined her at the railing, his hand finding hers. The gesture was simple, practiced, not the grasp of possession but of partnership. Together, they watched the reflection of the city lights ripple across the water. Grace exhaled, a slow release of everything she'd been holding in. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was healing. Richard turned to her after a long moment. "You handled yourself well today," he said softly. "You didn't need me to walk in, but I'm glad I did." His tone wasn't boastful, just matter of fact. She smiled faintly, her eyes still on the horizon. "I thought I was going to break," she whispered. "But then I realized I already have many times. I just know how to rebuild." He squeezed her hand, his thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles. "You know," he said, voice low, "people will think I saved you today." Grace looked at him then, her expression steady but kind. "You didn't," she said. "You just reminded me who I already was." Richard nodded once, the faintest hint of a smile crossing his face. Inside the apartment, the clock ticked past midnight. The city outside was quiet, a faint hum of cars and gulls in the distance. Grace leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. For once, she didn't feel small. She felt infinite, like the calm after the tide recedes. She knew there would still be whispers. That not everyone would understand how something so ordinary, a waitress, a restaurant, a manager, could hold such violence and redemption inside it. But she didn't care. Power didn't always announce itself in grand victories. Sometimes it showed up as a woman who refused to be quiet anymore. The night wrapped around them, soft and forgiving. Richard's hand remained in hers, unmoving, anchoring her to this moment, to this peace. No speeches. No apologies. just presence. And that was enough. He turned his head slightly, his voice barely above the wind. "I'm proud of how you handled him," he said. "I didn't save you. You did." Grace smiled, her eyes glinting like the harbor lights. "Maybe," she whispered. "But you were there when I remembered how." By the following morning, the story had already begun to circulate. Staff who hadn't been working that day showed up whispering, piecing together fragments of what they'd heard from the line cooks, the busboys, the hostess who'd seen the door swing open. No one needed confirmation. Grace's walk through the dining room with Admiral Miller had spoken louder than any press release. Carl's absence was immediate and absolute. His name was scrubbed off the shift roster before lunch service began. The air inside Harborview shifted palpably. Conversations flowed more freely, like a knot in the center of the room had finally come undone. Laughter returned to corners of the kitchen where it hadn't lived in months. The new manager on duty, a soft-spoken woman from corporate named Dina, seemed unsure of how to address the elephant in the room. But Grace? Grace just kept working. She moved with the same poise as always, but her steps felt different now, no longer cautious, no longer apologizing for space she was entitled to. Her coworkers noticed. A few of them began stepping a little taller, like the freedom she found had rippled outward. People who had stayed quiet during Carl's reign of quiet cruelty now nodded to her in passing, small gestures of recognition that held more weight than they seemed. Harborview wasn't perfect, but it was healing. On the third day after Carl's firing, one of the newer servers, Miguel, asked Grace quietly if they could talk. He stood by the walk-in cooler, twisting the edge of his apron in his hands. I saw what happened that day," he said. "Anne, I've heard stuff. Stuff Carl used to say about you. About others too." Grace didn't push. She waited. Eventually, the story came out, not dramatic, not violent, but insidious. Carl mocking Miguel's accent when he thought no one was listening. Calling a hostess too curvy for the front of house. Punishing staff with passive-aggressive scheduled changes if they spoke up. It was all there, quiet, well-worn patterns that no one had stopped. A few more came forward in the days that followed. A dishwasher named Tanya admitted she used to dread every Saturday because Carl always picked on her pace. The bartender, Jonah, shared how he'd been reprimanded for challenging management when he suggested Carl double-booked shifts unfairly. None of it surprised Grace. But hearing it, all of it, only solidified what she already knew. Carl hadn't been a bad manager. He'd been a calculated manipulator. Word of these confessions reached Harold Fenn, the general manager, by the end of the week. To his credit, he didn't deflect or diminish them. He called a staff meeting in the dining room, closed to customers for 1 hour on a Wednesday afternoon. Grace sat near the back, arms folded lightly, her expression unreadable. But when Harold took the mic, he looked straight at her. "I failed many of you," he said plainly. "I ignored signs, dismissed whispers, and I let leadership become a shield for harm. That ends now." Around the room, heads nodded. Some in surprise, some in quiet relief. He continued, announcing the immediate implementation of a new internal reporting system, anonymous, third-party, and fully confidential. He outlined plans for regular one-on-one staff check-ins, bi-weekly mental health roundtables, and clearly documented boundaries for managerial conduct. A local therapist would be coming in every other Friday for drop-in sessions. The word well-being was no longer a corporate bullet point, it had become a promise. And for the first time, it felt like more than lip service. After the meeting, Harold pulled Grace aside. His eyes looked more tired than usual, but his tone was sincere. "We want to offer you Carl's position. Full manager. Higher pay, full benefits, leadership training included." He smiled gently. "Frankly, you've already been doing the job." Grace didn't answer right away. She took a long breath, glancing out at the staff resetting the tables in the distance. It would have been a natural fit. She knew the place, the people, the rhythm. But something in her had already shifted, and she couldn't pretend to want what she no longer believed in. "Thank you," she said finally. "But I'm going to pass." Harold's brow furrowed slightly, confused. "If not this," he asked, "then what?" Grace smiled then, softly but with something new behind it. Something mine, she said. Something built from the ground up, where peace isn't mistaken for weakness. Harold nodded, and though he looked disappointed, he understood. Maybe leadership meant knowing when to let people go where they're needed most, even if that meant somewhere else. Later that day, as Grace refilled the coffee station, one of the line cooks leaned over the prep table, watching her in quiet admiration. "You've been holding this place together," he said with a shake of his head. "For longer than anyone realized." Grace chuckled, half amused, half humbled. "Not always gracefully." He smiled. "Maybe not. But imagine what you could build from scratch." That sentence lingered long after the shift ended. That night at home, Grace stood by the kitchen window while Richard chopped vegetables beside her. "What would you think," she asked slowly, "if I wanted to open something of my own?" Richard didn't even pause. "I think you're overdue," he said. They talked late into the night about names, locations, hours, menu ideas. About community and second chances. About how people needed more places to breathe without fear. Richard said he could help with planning, with funding, with whatever she needed. But he made one thing very clear: this would be hers. Grace smiled at the idea, not because of ambition, but because of what it represented. Not escape. Not revenge. Freedom. She wasn't running from something anymore. She was walking toward it. The idea took root quietly, like something already growing beneath the surface of Grace's mind. After years of carrying others' weight, she finally envisioned a space where warmth was intentional, not performative. She wanted laughter that wasn't cautious, tables that didn't carry tension, and voices that didn't whisper from fear. When she told Richard she was ready, truly ready, he simply nodded and said, "Tell me where to start." And just like that, they did. They found the location 2 blocks from the harbor, tucked into the corner of a breezy street with old brick, a salt-kissed awning, and tall windows aching for sunlight. The space had once been a bookstore, and though it needed work, Grace could already see the soul of what it could become. Richard handled the licensing, the legalese, the financing, but Grace chose every beam, every thread of fabric, every shade of paint. Her hands were in the place before the doors ever opened. It wasn't just her dream, it was her name on it. They named it Anchor and Grace. Richard had suggested it one evening, after watching her run her fingertips across a color swatch of soft sea blue. "It fits," he said. "You've always been both." The name held weight without being heavy. It spoke of strength, but also stillness. Grace painted the walls in muted tones that reminded her of calm seas and early mornings. The beams overhead were stained honey dark, grounding the open space in warmth. Tables were simple but solid wood, never plastic, and each one held a tiny pot of lavender or rosemary. Sunlight filtered in through white curtains, catching dust motes that danced in the quiet before guests arrived. Nothing flashy, just a space that felt honest. She curated the menu herself, not to impress, but to comfort. Sourdough toast with herbed butter. Tea served in real porcelain. A house-made cinnamon blend she had once served to Richard when they were first dating, long before uniforms and deployments. Everything had a memory attached. Every item told a story. When the grand opening day arrived, there were no press releases, no ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Just a chalkboard outside that read "Now Open" in neat cursive, and the smell of warm pastries drifting into the morning breeze. The first person to walk through the door was Tanya, the dishwasher from Harborview, now freshly promoted there. She hugged Grace without asking and sat at the window seat. Miguel followed minutes later, offering to help bus tables even though he was off that day. One by one, familiar faces appeared. Jonah from the bar brought flowers. Dina from corporate dropped off a set of mugs with the café's name etched in them. Even Harold stopped by, looking quietly proud, offering a handshake and staying longer than he meant to. Grace didn't cry, but her hands trembled once, just briefly, as she carried out the first tray. It wasn't nerves. It was knowing she was exactly where she was meant to be. On the wall behind the counter, she hung a framed piece of hand-lettered calligraphy. The quote read, "Strength doesn't always shout." Beneath it, in smaller script, sometimes, it stands quietly behind the counter and remembers its worth. The quote became a quiet touchstone. Customers often paused to read it, their fingers grazing the glass like it had been written just for them. It wasn't just decoration. It was declaration. The café began to bloom slowly, like a place people stumbled upon and felt lucky to find. Local artists offered to display their work. A small poetry reading group asked to host Sunday afternoons. A Navy spouse network asked if they could meet there once a month. Grace said yes without hesitation. The place became a gathering point, not just for food, but for calm. Regulars returned not because it was trendy, but because it felt safe. There was something about the space, something steady, like breathing room in a busy world. Richard came often, though he never stayed long during the day. He always took the back corner table, sipping slowly, reading, always with one eye on her, not possessive, just proud. He called it the best seat in the house. Sometimes, after closing, Grace would wipe down the table slowly, remembering the way Carl used to bark orders across the kitchen like a king in a crumbling castle. There was no barking here. No one needed to raise their voice. Respect wasn't demanded, it was simply lived. And in every corner of Anchor and Grace, that truth bloomed. One evening, just before locking up, a young woman approached the counter, someone Grace didn't know. She looked nervous, twisting a keychain between her fingers. "I just wanted to say, this place feels different," she said. "It's quiet, but it doesn't feel empty. It feels like I can breathe here." Grace smiled gently. That's the whole point. As the seasons changed, so did the café's rhythm. Tourists trickled in during warmer months, students during exam weeks, parents with strollers in the early morning light. Grace welcomed them all with the same steady calm, never rushed, never rehearsed. It wasn't performance. It was presence. At night, when the lights dimmed and chairs were flipped up onto tables, Grace often stood in the center of the café alone. She would close her eyes, take a breath, and feel the heartbeat of the place. She didn't think about Carl anymore. Not because she had forgotten, but because she no longer carried him with her. The space he once took up had been repurposed for peace. Anchor and Grace wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. But it was strong. And strength, Grace had learned, didn't need to announce itself. It just needed a place to grow. What would your version of Anchor and Grace look like? A space built not out of escape, but out of quiet purpose? Let us know in the comments. Sometimes the life you rebuild becomes the one you were meant to live all along. It was a Thursday morning when he walked in, the kind of morning that smelled like cinnamon and rain. The cafe was gently buzzing, full of warmth and the quiet hum of conversation and clinking mugs. Grace was behind the counter, polishing a stack of ceramic plates when she caught the figure in the doorway. He wore a charcoal gray blazer, too sharp for comfort, too familiar to ignore. Her breath didn't hitch. She simply blinked once and kept wiping. Carl Denton looked thinner than she remembered, not physically, but in presence, in posture. The arrogance that used to puff up his chest had deflated just slightly, though the smirk still clung to his lips like a bad habit. He walked in like someone who believed he still owned the room, scanning the space with a practiced air of authority. It didn't land the same way here. Anchor and Grace wasn't Harborview. "Grace," he said, tone slick, like old oil trying to pass as water. "This place looks nice." She met his gaze for a brief moment, expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said simply. She didn't ask what he wanted. She already knew. He walked toward the counter with his hands tucked into his coat pockets, pretending not to notice how every eye in the room tracked him. Jonah, now part-time at both restaurants, tensed slightly at a side table. Tanya froze mid-pour. But Grace didn't flinch. This was her space. "I thought I'd stop in," Carl said, like they were old friends meeting by coincidence. "Figured maybe we could talk. Start fresh." His voice tried to strike a note of humility, but it cracked under its own weight. He looked around. "Looks like you're doing well. You've come a long way." Grace folded the towel she'd been holding and placed it gently beside the register. "We're not having this conversation, Carl." Her tone wasn't harsh, it was calm, definitive, the sound of a door closing without a slam. "You're not welcome here." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Carl chuckled, but it was hollow, defensive. "Come on, don't be like that. I've changed." People change. He leaned an elbow on the counter. Don't tell me you're still mad about the past. It's business. That's all it ever was. Before Grace could respond, a quiet movement came from the back of the room. Richard stood up slowly, setting his cup down with deliberate ease. He had been sitting at his usual table by the window, out of sight until now, reading a folded newspaper. When Carl caught sight of him, the color drained from his face. The cafe quieted, not from fear, but anticipation. Richard walked forward with the same presence that had once cleared conference rooms and command decks. But today, he wore no medals, no dress whites, just a simple navy sweater and a steel gaze. He stopped beside Grace, not in front of her, not shielding her, but beside her. Equal. Present. You still not used to hearing no from someone stronger than you? Richard asked, voice low and clear. Carl blinked. His mouth opened, then closed again. The smirk vanished completely, like a mask removed by force. I wasn't trying to start anything, he muttered. Just thought I'd stop in. Richard raised an eyebrow. Then keep walking. He didn't have to say more. The message was carved into the air around him, carved by presence, not by threat. Grace didn't move. She didn't touch Richard's arm. She didn't need to. Carl looked around again, as if expecting someone to come to his defense, but no one did. Tanya returned to refilling water glasses without a glance his way. Jonah crossed his arms and stepped closer to the counter, just in case. Customers returned to their conversations with quiet murmurs. No one offered him a seat. With a stiff nod and a muttered, "Suit yourself," Carl turned and walked out, the small brass bell above the door offering the only sound of his retreat. He didn't look back. He didn't slam the door. He just disappeared into the street, smaller than when he came in. Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew what it had taken not to let him linger. Richard turned to her with a quiet smile, pride flickering in his eyes. You didn't need me to stand up, he said. But I'll always be the one who does. She smiled, reaching for his hand over the counter. I know, she said. But it felt good anyway. They returned to their rhythm, the energy in the room steadying once more. A new customer walked in moments later, unaware of the shadow that had briefly passed through. Grace greeted her with the same warmth she gave everyone, a reminder that Carl's presence had changed nothing here. This place wasn't his story. It was hers. Later that afternoon, as sunlight poured across the cafe floorboards, Grace caught her reflection in the glass. Calm. Certain. Whole. The man in the gray suit had tried to haunt her past. But she had already rewritten her future. The late afternoon light poured through the tall cafe windows, casting soft gold across the floorboards and the worn corners of books left behind on cozy window seats. The scent of roasted coffee, cinnamon, and something gently citrus filled the air like a signature. Conversations hummed low but warm, the kind that didn't need to hurry, didn't need to impress. Laughter occasionally broke out from the back table, where two retired Navy spouses played cards every Thursday. Anchor and Grace had become less of a cafe and more of a rhythm, steady, slow, and deeply human. A pair of college students tapped away at laptops near the counter, their drinks long since emptied, but their presence welcome. A mother rocked her baby gently at a corner table, sipping chamomile while reading a paperback. A painter sat near the window, sketching strangers with kind lines. Regulars came and stayed, sometimes for hours, sometimes just long enough to exhale. The world outside buzzed, but inside the cafe, it simply breathed. Grace moved between tables like the tide, present but never intrusive. Her apron tied loosely, her sleeves rolled up, her movements as natural as the space itself. She didn't hover, didn't fuss. She simply was. And in that stillness, the entire room felt held. At the far end of the cafe, near the small community bookshelf, a new server named Ellie wiped down a table with careful precision. She was 19, earnest, and eager to learn, and Grace had taken a quiet liking to her. As Grace refilled a carafe nearby, Ellie looked up and asked softly, "Can I ask you something?" Grace nodded. "Were you ever scared?" "Back then, with Carl." The question floated between them for a moment, suspended in the steam of fresh coffee and unspoken memories. Grace didn't answer right away. She finished pouring, wiped the spout with a clean cloth, and set the carafe back into place. Then she looked at Ellie, not down, not away, but level. "Yes," she said simply. "I was scared. But I learned that being scared doesn't mean you're not strong." Ellie nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. Grace gave her a small smile, then turned to greet a pair of new customers with a quiet welcome. Behind her, Ellie stood a little straighter, as if those few words had settled something inside her. That was the thing about this place, the lessons weren't loud. But they lasted. The bell above the door chimed, a sound so familiar it might have gone unnoticed by most. But Grace heard it. She always did. She turned just in time to see him step inside. Richard wore his dress blues, crisp, clean, polished straight from a visit to the Naval Academy, where he had given a guest lecture on leadership and resilience. His cap rested under his arm, and his presence, even in the quiet of the café, still held gravity. A few heads turned, not in alarm, but in curiosity, then recognition. Grace's face softened immediately. She walked toward him, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're early," she said with a smile. "Couldn't wait," he replied, his voice just for her. She leaned up and kissed his cheek, and the room around them continued on, respectful, warm, unintrusive. It was just another piece of the Anchor and Grace rhythm. A nearby customer leaned over to her friend and whispered, "That's her husband, right? The Admiral." Her friend nodded. "That's them. You should have seen what happened months ago, when he came in and put a man in his place without ever raising his voice." They both turned back toward their tea, smiling. Richard took his usual spot, the back corner near the window, where he could see the water if he leaned just right. Grace brought him his tea without asking. They didn't need many words between them anymore. They had lived through the ones that mattered. As the sun dipped lower, the café grew even softer, the warm light replaced by amber lamps, their glow brushing gently across the café's signature quote behind the counter, "Strength doesn't always shout." A small jazz trio arrived for the evening set, quietly setting up in the corner with their instruments and smiles. A customer asked for an extra scone, and Grace passed it across the counter with a nod. Ellie hummed along with the music as she swept the back hallway. Richard glanced up occasionally from his paper, catching Grace in motion, watching the life she'd built in full bloom. There had been a time when she'd stood in a different hallway, one tiled, cold, closed. A time when silence meant survival, when fear curled beneath her ribs like something permanent. But now, her silence was her choice. It was filled with peace, not submission. And in that space, she had rebuilt herself, cup by cup, kindness by kindness. Later that evening, as the last of the guests filtered out and the jazz trio packed their instruments, Grace flipped the sign to "closed." She turned back into the café and, for a moment, simply stood still. Chairs were stacked. Lights were dimmed. And everything felt exactly as it should. Richard rose from his table and walked over, slipping one arm around her waist. "Place looks good," he murmured. "Feels better," she replied, leaning into him. "It finally feels like home." They stood there in the center of her café, their café, surrounded by the echoes of laughter, soft jazz, and stories traded over steaming mugs. Anchor and Grace wasn't just a name anymore. It was a promise. A destination for anyone who needed a quiet reminder that being seen could be gentle, and being strong didn't always require a fight. Grace looked toward the window, where the harbor shimmered in the distance, moonlight skipping across the water. She remembered who she had been, not to mourn her, but to honor her. And then she let that memory settle quietly into the walls of this place, like everything else that mattered. She didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. She just needed to stop hiding from it. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. There's another interesting one on your left screen that I think you'll really enjoy.